Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Omar Zaza. I'm the Italian president. So, I know who you're all here to see, so I'm not going to take up too much of your time. I just have a few things I'd like to say before we can get the event underway. So, first let us remember that tomorrow marks the anniversary of the Nakba, the occasion upon which over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes in accordance with the formal declaration of the founding of the State of Israel. And our observation of this date takes on a particular urgency this year in light of the arrest of Rasmi al-Auda. And for those of you who don't know Rasmi al-Auda, she is the Associate Director of the Arab American Action Network. A U.S. citizen who was born in Lifta, Palestine, just outside Jerusalem, and overcame vicious torture by Israeli military authorities while imprisoned in Palestine in the 70s, and is a legend to millions of Palestinians who continue to organize for their rights of liberation, equality, and return. Last October, Auda was arrested and indicted for allegedly falsifying information on her immigration application form from 20 years ago. And Rasmi is scheduled to go on trial on June 20th and June 10th in Detroit, where she originally entered the U.S. There's currently an ongoing campaign for these charges to be dropped, and friends and supporters are strongly encouraged to join in packing the courtroom every day of her trial. For now, let us begin this event by declaring, we support Palestine, we support women, and we support Rasmi. On the topic of necessary acknowledgements, so obviously we are students for justice in Palestine. And yet we also owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to the distinguished faculty and various other campus employees who have aided and continue to aid us in our struggle. We'd like to thank Professor Angela Davis for her gracious agreement to participate in our event tonight, especially in light of her impacted schedule this quarter. Let us also take this opportunity to extend our gratitude to the unwavering support of Professors Asli, Bali, and Kelley, who have also tirelessly supported SJP in ways too numerous to list, but which include much needed words of intellectual, moral, and legal advice, as well as participation in and gracious support for SJP functions. And lastly, I would also like to thank Terry from the Seoul office, who's right over there. Through, thick and thin, all kinds of interesting turnabouts and events. So with that said, let me transition now briefly to some bios for the speakers, and these will be done in order of appearance. So Asli Bali is Assistant Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law. She teaches public international law, international human rights, and a seminar on the laws of war. She joined the UCLA Law School faculty from Yale Law School, where she was the Irving S. Rubikoff Fellow in Law and coordinator of the Middle East Legal Forum. Next, through her activism and scholarship over the last decades, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in our nation's quest for social justice. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender equality. She is the author of 9 books and is Professor Emerita of History of Consciousness and Feminist Studies at UC Santa Cruz. In recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the generalized criminalization of those communities that are most affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws upon her own experiences in the early 70s as a person who spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. She is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to the dismantling of the prison industrial complex. Internationally, she is affiliated with Sisters Inside, an abolitionist organization based in Queensland, Australia, that works in solidarity with women in prison. Having helped to popularize the notion of the prison industrial complex, she now urges her audience to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons and help forge the 21st century abolitionist movement. Robin Kelley's research has explored the history of social movements in the U.S., the African diaspora, Africa, Black intellectuals, music, visual culture, contemporary urban studies, historiography and historical theory, poverty studies and ethnography, colonialism and imperialism, organized labor, constructions of race, surrealism, Marxism, and nationalism, among other things. His essays have appeared in a wide variety of professional journals as well as general publications, including the Journal of American History, American Historical Review, Black Music Research Journal, African Studies Review, New York Times Leisure, New York Times Magazine, The Crisis, The Nation, The Voice Literary Supplement, and Counterpunch, to name a few. His latest big project is a biography of the late Grace Halsell, tentatively titled The Education of Miss Grace Halsell, An Intimate History of the American Century. Please now join me in welcoming our first speaker, Asli, to the stage.
Well, I want to start first by saying what an incredible honor it is for me to be at an event with both Robin Kelley and Angela Davis, and also to add to the bio that was given for Professor Davis in particular by noting what a loss her absence has been for UCLA for so many decades now, and how wonderful it is to have her back. I wish I had had the privilege of being here in those years, but in any case, it's wonderful to share a podium. I was asked to begin our discussion today by speaking about the prospects for the peace process, international law. So as you heard, I teach human rights, international humanitarian law, laws of war. These are all topics that are directly relevant, obviously, to the circumstances in Israel-Palestine. So peace process, international law, and how to move forward. Now, I take it that this is an audience that is quite well versed in all three of these categories. But I'm just going to take a moment to give you maybe more of an analytic framework for thinking about how we've gotten to the point that we've gotten to and what the paths look like going forward. So to begin with, what was Oslo? What was the peace process? And the best way, I think, to understand Oslo analytically was that it represented a moment in which the basic framework for thinking about this conflict, which was until 1993 an international law framework that began from the premise that this is a belligerent occupation in an asymmetric context in which Israel had committed, through the 1967 war, the acts that led to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and was under an international law obligation to withdraw from those territories and make amends for the many harms that had been associated with that occupation, to shift from that framework to a political negotiating framework in which these two parties, unequally situated as they were to somehow come to an agreed upon, not strictly international law governed outcome, which was to be mediated by the United States. So you can imagine what that process means in practice. What that process means in practice is, first of all, that might makes right. It removes the legal framework altogether, the one thing that had any prospect of actually focusing on questions of rights of Palestinians in particular, and moves instead to what can be bargained for between these two parties in conditions of deep inequality. And moreover, interposes the United States as the party that would mediate between the two as to the terms of their discussions. The United States, which of course poses itself as primarily and has repeatedly throughout the process insisted that its number one interest is protecting Israel's own security interests and assisting Israel in achieving its own objectives. So under these conditions, needless to say, Oslo was a peace process which from the outset involved the negotiating away of Palestinian rights. That was the process that was put in place, and it had numerous features that I think are notable and worth emphasizing at the outset. What was happening in 1993? So the Iraq Gulf War had happened. The Palestinian Liberation Organization had taken a strong position in favor of Iraq, the Iraqi government, under those circumstances, and as a result had lost the vast majority of support that it had from the Arab Gulf states. So it was a deeply weakened actor based out of Tunis. At the same time, in the early 1990s, an indigenous organic leadership had emerged in the West Bank and Gaza that had given leadership to the first Intifada, a nonviolent resistance movement that emerged out of Gaza and then spread to the West Bank as well in 1987, and had led talks with Israel in Madrid 2 years earlier, and had actually represented a relatively formidable opponent to Israel, an adversary in the negotiating process that insisted upon a rights-based framework and wouldn't budge around the idea that the negotiations were to shift to a more political framework, a bargain to be struck. So what did Oslo facilitate beyond the shift precisely to that kind of a bargaining context? It also facilitated the displacement of that local leadership connected to civil society in the West Bank and in Gaza, and to organic movements that had emerged throughout the 1980s and then in the early 1990s in the territories, and displaced it in favor of this weakened leadership that was based out of exile in Tunis, which was designated as a representative of the Palestinian people and was given the opportunity to speak exclusively in their name, which then set in motion the process that many who have studied this conflict are very familiar with, which is the creation of a kind of new bourgeoisie brought in out of exile to the West Bank and initially to Gaza, that became incredibly invested in maintaining a set of privileges and identities as the elite representative of the Palestinian factions, which then gave them their own investment in maintaining a process. So this is what Oslo set up as a framework. The next question then is, why did it fail? We hear it constantly now in the news following the kind of pause that's been put in place by the Obama-Kerry team on diplomacy with Israel-Palestine, that there's been a failure in talks. Of course, the Oslo process did not fail if you understand it in the terms that I just laid it out. Quite to the contrary, it succeeded. It succeeded in a very grand terms in accomplishing the objectives of the Israelis in entering into this process in 1993, while deferring indefinitely any aspiration that Palestinians might have either for self-determination or for the realization of rights under an international law framework, or for anything like a reasonable standard of living in the West Bank and Gaza, let alone put to the side the status of Jerusalem, the ongoing settlement construction, the rights of refugees, and so forth. So the Oslo process succeeded, and it succeeded wildly. The question shouldn't be, why did the process fail, but how has the process become stalled? Why is it not continuing to succeed in quite the same way? And the answer is that the Palestinians have decided to render this process unsustainable at some level by refusing to continue their own participation in their dispossession. So that's the moment that we find ourselves in today, and I think understanding that framework is the key to beginning to think about how to proceed. But okay, let's first analyze what actually happened under Oslo. So what were the concrete actions that occurred under that framework, and what are the outcomes that we see on the ground today? To begin with, the standard of living of the average Palestinian declined dramatically in the 20 plus years that characterized this peace process for Palestinians. So their freedom of movement has been dramatically restricted, the actual capacity to be productive economy has been restricted. In Gaza, of course, the population lives under a state of actual siege on a continual basis and are facing every kind of deprivation one can imagine, but even in the West Bank, conditions have deteriorated dramatically. At the same time, settlement growth was so radically expanded that we've seen a doubling of the settlements in the 20 years, or more than doubling of the settlements in the 20 years since the Oslo process has been in place. And just in the 9 months during which the Kerry framework was in place, 14,000 new construction in the West Bank, 14,000 new units of housing were authorized by the Israeli government. So what we've seen under the Oslo framework is an acceleration of the expropriation of Palestinian lands and the growth of settlements. At the same time, we've also seen that Oslo provided cover for the forced population transfer of Palestinians from various lands. First of all, it created a framework that designated different zones in the West Bank, areas A, B, and C. And for those Palestinians living in area C under direct Israeli control, we've seen conditions deteriorate to the point that it has forced Palestinians to face a sort of quiet deportation to the other zones where they might have some greater degree of control over their lives. But probably the most sort of focal point of this project of forcible deportation and transfer, which elsewhere in the world might be called ethnic cleansing, the goal of removing a particular population demographically from a part of land in order to maintain a different demographic balance on that land. That has been most acute in East Jerusalem. I'm going to turn to that in a moment as just a microcosm of what's been accomplished in terms of forcible transfer of Palestinians. The flip side of which, of course, is the consensual transfer of the Israeli civilian population into the West Bank, both of which are direct violations of international law governing occupation, to which I'll turn when we discuss international law briefly in a moment. But one other feature before describing East Jerusalem that I think is really worth emphasizing, I've mentioned the creation of this Palestinian elite, this bourgeoisie, and their role beyond serving as negotiators has been to serve as wardens within the zones that have been created that involve population concentrations of Palestinians. So the Israelis have not only created a system of control governed by and subcontracted to Palestinians, but they've also managed to remove from themselves a set of obligations that they carried under international law, specifically to provide for the humanitarian welfare of the civilian population under occupation. Now, this has not just been subcontracted to the Palestinians, although they are the service delivery agents for basic things like trash collection, municipal services, educational services, and so forth. It's actually been shifted entirely to the international community, and specifically to the European Union, which has been the primary funder of this mechanism. So the Israelis have managed to relieve themselves of the burden of maintaining this population, even as they increase their control over larger and larger swaths of the land on which the population lived, and forcibly transfer the population off that land. Okay, so let's just turn to the microcosm of East Jerusalem for a moment before then moving on to what this process might look like going forward. So, as I mentioned, East Jerusalem represents an important example, but only one example. Others are Area C, which is about 62% of the West Bank, the Jordan Valley, and even within the 1948 borders of Israel, the Negev itself, where again you see the forcible removal of the indigenous population from its own territories. So first, in 1967, when Jerusalem was first brought under Israeli control, 80,000 Palestinians were directly evicted from West Jerusalem. So the population in Jerusalem of Palestinians was halved just immediately upon the control that Israel established over Jerusalem as a city. And then the annexation of 70 square kilometers around Jerusalem was the next move, again, immediately in the aftermath of the war itself, in order to expand and integrate much of the West Bank into a kind of greater Jerusalem municipality, and then transform Palestinian residency in these territories. So the remaining Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem and the suburbs around it that were integrated into greater Jerusalem transformed their residency from a right, the right that they had as the native inhabitants of that land, property holders, title deeds, and so forth, into a privilege dependent on a permit system created by the Israelis, which governed whether they might be able to remain and what kinds of political participation they could engage in as residents there. And then the next move was to restrict access to those permits and to relieve individuals of the permits to which they were entitled, which has led so far since 1967 to 20,000 Palestinians of the remaining population that was in Jerusalem having their permits withdrawn under one pretext or another, so that the regulatory scheme that gets created first removes half the population, then restricts access for the remaining population through a permit system that then is increasingly subject to restriction and to reduction. At the same time, the quiet deportation that has resulted from the removal of the permits has been paralleled with Israeli demographic goals for the city of bringing in a much larger proportion of Jewish residents to the city and creating, the goal is a 70-30 mix in the city. So 70% Jewish, 30% Palestinian, which is obviously in stark contrast to where Jerusalem was in 1967, but it's even in contrast to where it is today, where you see more of a 60-40 balance. And so in response to this, what you have is zoning restrictions, making it impossible for Palestinians to build on their own land, educational restrictions, municipal service restrictions, basically a choking of civil life in Jerusalem for the Palestinian residents and Palestinian neighborhoods, again, with the goal of shifting that Palestinian population ideally to Area A or somewhere else, outside altogether of the territory under the control of Israel. So this is just one example of what the forcible transfer looks like of the Palestinian population that needs to be set aside the much more prominent story of the consensual transfer of Israeli civilians into the West Bank and into Palestinian lands. Okay, so if this is what Oslo accomplished, massive expansion of settlements, forcible transfer of Palestinians, the shift away from an international law framework, the reduction in any kind of a rights framework for Palestinians to rely upon, what does the process look like going forward? What has happened at the moment that has led to the stalling? And one of the answers to that, I've said already that Palestinians have withdrawn their willingness to participate fully in their own dispossession. So that's one part, and that's even at the level of the elite that I described that was created in the Palestinian Authority has limited its willingness to continue participating in the talks. But on the flip side, you have a much more explicit set of commitments on the part of the Israeli government. For example, the chairman of the Likud party, which is the governing party of Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel, has said, first, that there will never be a Palestinian state. So the one thing that Oslo did establish as a premise was that it would give meaning to the land for peace formula, which would require Palestinians in particular and Arab countries more generally to enter into peace with Israel in exchange for the creation of a Palestinian state. So when Danny Danon, the current chairman of Likud, says there will not be a Palestinian state, he's basically saying we're no longer willing to honor the terms on the basis of which we previously have pursued our objectives of increasing control of land in the West Bank. We're going to shift to a different framework. And what is that framework? He says Israel's goal, and this is in a set of interviews that were published in The Guardian by Chris McGreal, Israel's goal is to take the bulk of West Bank land while rid Israel of responsibility for governing the mass of Palestinians. So maximize your control of land, minimize the population for which you're responsible, which obviously was a strategy that was accelerated by Oslo, but now Oslo has run its course because the notion that a two-state solution is sustainable still requires Israel to leave some semblance of territory that's contiguous in the hands of Palestinians. That's no longer part of the goals of the chairman, for example, of the governing party of Israel. So rather what we now see, and this is the word that John Kerry used recently and was excoriated for using the word apartheid, setting aside the polemics and terminology and whether or not how we should define apartheid, which is something, a separate topic I'd be more than happy to discuss in a different context, the main reason for the raising of this framework is that when you concentrate the population, the civilian population, in smaller and smaller parts of land, while annexing larger and larger swaths of territory from which it's been forcibly removed, you begin to develop a regulatory regime for the control of that population with permits and passes and restrictions on movement and concentration in particular places that resembles very closely a particular strategy that was adopted at a particular moment by the South African government. And that's the comparison to which McGreal and others, anybody who uses this, and by the way, the place where this language has become most common in describing the current trajectory that the Israeli government appears to be on with its annexation policies, the place that this is most commonly used, this word and this framing, is in Israel itself. So in Israeli political discourse, this is a term that's used quite frequently in the media and that's debated as to whether or not this is the direction that the whole process is moving. And in the end, I'm just going to turn back to why that might be a real concern. But okay, so we're now at a point where we have a number of Israeli leaders that are coming forward and saying the two-state solution is not for us, and we intend to limit our responsibility for Palestinian populations, civilians, while maximizing our control of Palestinian land in the West Bank. We have other leaders that are coming forward and saying there were opportunities for a two-state solution that were lost. Shimon Peres, notably, just this week made a comment that in 2011 he had negotiated a two-state formula with the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, and had been shelved because Benjamin Netanyahu and Tony Blair, the international representative over the peace process, had said, we can get a better deal, you don't need to take that deal. And in the backdrop, you have ongoing creeping annexation. So where has the peace process brought us at this point? I think it's brought us to a stalled moment where Israel has maximized the objectives it can attain using that particular framework, and the Palestinians have essentially exhausted their willingness to be participants in the dispossession that has resulted from Oslo. So what then are other prospects? One alternative might be to return to the international law framework. That framework was taken off the table, maybe we can come back to it. What are the prospects for using international law? I would say they're extraordinarily limited. Now it's understandable why international law was the original framework. To begin with, this entire state, the state of Israel, the non-existent state of the Palestinians, the partition of the land that was once historic Palestine, all of this was accomplished through international law frameworks. The UN General Assembly issued a resolution, Resolution 181, in 1947 that called for the partition of the land and the creation of two states. And following that, there have been numerous UN General Assembly resolutions, UN Security Council resolutions that regulate the terms on which any negotiations or peace process or so forth, the framework upon which they're supposed to proceed, including Resolution 194 from the General Assembly calling for the right of Palestinian refugees to return or be given compensation for the loss of property, the UN Security Council Resolution 242, which calls for Israel to withdraw from the territories occupied following the 1967 war, UN Security Council Resolution 476 in 1980, which repudiates Israel's purported annexation of Jerusalem, UN Security Council Resolution 1397, explicitly calling for a two-state solution, and then 1515 in 2003, stating that that solution would have to be on the basis of Madrid principles, which are the principles that were established before Oslo, the Arab Peace Initiative, something that was adopted by the Arab League, and the Quartet Roadmap, which was developed under the George W. Bush administration, which laid out the phases by which one was supposed to resolve questions like settlements, refugees, final borders, etc. Now, I mention all of this because I've just told you that process has stalled and failed, and that it achieved nothing like the international law objectives that were laid out, but rather further dispossessed Palestinians. So to begin with, you should understand that the General Assembly and Security Council frameworks, to the extent that they exist at all, have been displaced or have facilitated the process that I described to you a moment ago, which accomplished none of the objectives that had originally been set forth. So what are other alternatives beyond the UN resolutions? One that's very frequently cited is the framework of international humanitarian law, which governs belligerent occupation, and notably the Fourth Geneva Convention, which basically gives obligations to a state like Israel for the welfare of the civilian population that it's occupying. And the question is, can international humanitarian law be something that would provide a framework to restore rights for Palestinians? The trouble with that is that the international humanitarian law framework, the Fourth Geneva Convention, did not anticipate extended belligerent occupation that would continue for almost half a century and has no prospect of ending at this point. And as a result, what it required was that the belligerent occupants, so the authority that's occupying the territory, provide for welfare, but not afford democratic rights, not afford political participation, not afford any of the various things that one would expect after generations of living under a political sovereign that in fact makes every determination for all aspects of your life, but rather sought to preserve the self-determining rights of the population under occupation. Now that's obviously laudable. That's incredibly important for Palestinians to retain the right to become sovereign, to govern themselves, and so forth. But as that material reality fades, as the possibility of that kind of self-determination fades, what the international humanitarian law framework, what the Fourth Geneva Convention allows, is for the Israelis to do precisely what's happened now, which is on the one hand, transfer to the international community, to Palestinian wardens, to others, the basic burdens, the basic obligations to the civilian population, while on the other hand, indefinitely deferring the moment at which Palestinians may seek to gain political rights over their future under Israeli sovereignty, under Israeli governance, which is the scenario that we now face. So international humanitarian law has real limitations, and I'd be happy to talk more about what they are. What about international human rights law? Is that a possibility? Palestinian human rights are being violated on a continuous basis. Can we turn to international human rights law? In theory, absolutely. But what we see is when the UN Human Rights Council, as the preeminent actor in this arena, sends a commission to engage in fact-finding about whether massive human rights violations have occurred, say, in the Gaza war, or sends a special rapporteur to investigate the situation of human rights in the territories, what in fact has happened in the international arena is those entities have come to be demonized. The commission that engages in fact-finding is accused of having been politicized in a variety of ways, the Goldstone Commission, and ultimately dissolves, fails to create any kind of framework to engage in rights realization for the Palestinians. The special rapporteur is tarred with the brush of anti-Semitism, notwithstanding the fact that he is in fact a prominent left-leaning American Jewish legal expert, and ultimately his mission equally failed in large part because the framing, the political framing of the conflict makes it almost impossible to shift from the terms that have been dictated by the Israelis and by the Americans as mediators to a different framework, to an international human rights law framework. And in any case, there are very limited enforcement options in human rights, in international human rights, in the context of an ongoing conflict. So what's left then? There are international courts, and we've heard a lot about this. The Palestinians are entering into treaties. Maybe they might try to take Israel to court. Well, the Israelis were taken to court for an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice concerning the legality of the wall in 2004, and there was a decision that was issued by the International Court of Justice that the wall was indeed illegal to the extent that it ran inside the West Bank territory as opposed to along the 1967 border, and the consequence has been very little. There's been nothing that could be done at the international level to enforce it, and I doubt very much that the International Criminal Court will serve as any kind of a venue in which Palestinians will be able to get standing and bring a case regarding the violations of international human rights law, international humanitarian law that have been committed by the Israelis. So as a result then, where are we? Well, on the one-year anniversary of the issuance of the International Court of Justice's opinion, 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, university groups, student organizations, etc., came together and issued a call on behalf of Palestinian civil society, taking their lives back into their own hands, away from the Palestinian elites that had been governing as wardens of Israel and had been engaging in the negotiations, away from the Israeli occupation authorities, away from international mediators, away from frameworks that are basically extremely remote from the lived experience of individual Palestinians, and instead engaged in a civil society-based call for solidarity. And what they asked for is that there be a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign initiated against Israel for 3 specific objectives. Until the Israelis end their occupation of Palestinian lands, afford equality to Palestinian citizens within Israel, and promote the right of return of Palestinian refugees. So these are the 3 goals of the civil society movement's call, and the basis for their call, the reason that they say it makes sense to boycott, is first, the expropriation of the land and water of the indigenous population of Palestine. Second, the establishment of the settlements. Third, the failure to provide services for the occupied population. Fourth, the legal system of discrimination that the 20% of Israeli citizens who are Palestinian face. And finally, the refusal to recognize the rights of the 700,000 refugees that were expelled at the founding of the State of Israel. So these are the 5 categories of violations that the Israelis are held accountable for, and the call is to engage in BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, as a mechanism to hold Israel to account. Now, why is this something that is specifically directed at Americans? It's specifically directed at Americans in particular because the United States gives $3 billion of formal aid each year, which totals since 1948, $230 billion of transfers directly to the Israeli government to enable them to pursue these policies. And resonance in particular for this call here in the United States, and there have been a number of accomplishments, achievements that BDS has managed to put in place. In Europe in particular, divestment by banks, by pension funds, severing of ties with universities, and various other kinds of moves. But the main bottom line sort of framework that one needs to bear in mind when thinking about this is that this is a strategy of nonviolent progressive action call into account the Israeli government for particular actions, and specifically designed at the grassroots level to shift the narrative of Israeli impunity, to shift away from the two other frameworks I've described, the negotiating framework in which the United States serves as mediator, the international law framework where, again, the United States on the UN Security Council is able to shield Israel from criticism by exercising its veto, and in general, Israel cannot be held to account meaningfully because decisions, even when they're favorable, are unable to be enforced. So moving away from those two areas, the political and the legal, in which Israel has effectively enjoyed impunity for the strategy I've just described, and moving to a civil society movement, a solidarity movement that will end that narrative of impunity and that will raise the possibility of real awareness of the consequences of the Israeli strategies which have succeeded. So again, Oslo has not failed, it succeeded, it met its goals, and the response has been a civil society movement out of Palestine calling for solidarity to basically draw attention to Israeli impunity and bring an end to it. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Asli.
First of all, thank you for coming out this evening, and I'd like to thank the Students for Justice in Palestine for having invited me to participate in this event. So we learned a great deal about Asli Bali's presentation. Thank you so much. And I want to speak this evening as one who answered, who has tried to answer the call by Palestinian civil society for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. As some of you know, I spoke last Wednesday, only a week ago, and one of the things I said in that lecture was that as the eyes of the world were once focused on South Africa, we all need to be looking toward occupied Palestine today. So what I'd like to do is to focus my remarks on the importance of supporting the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. And as everyone knows, the call was issued in 2005 for a campaign, and I'm quoting, directly inspired by the struggle of South Africans against apartheid, and in the spirit of international solidarity, moral consistency, and resistance to injustice and oppression. And sometimes it helps to go back to original moments, and I'd like to just read a short section from that call. We, representatives of Palestinian civil society, call upon international civil society organizations and people of conscience all over the world to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment initiatives against Israel, similar to those applied to South Africa in the apartheid era. We appeal to you to pressure your respective states to impose embargoes and sanctions against Israel. We also invite conscientious Israelis to support this call for the sake of justice and genuine peace. And most of you know that this call was endorsed by political parties, Palestinian political parties, unions, associations, organizations of Palestinian refugees, Palestinians under occupation, and Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. In the summer of 2011, I traveled to the West Bank with a delegation of indigenous and women of color scholar activists. And we met with the BDS campaign in Ramallah, And at the end of our meeting, Omar Barghouti, whom some of you heard, said, and I'm quoting, "We are not asking you for heroic action or to form freedom brigades. We are simply asking you not to be complicit in perpetuating the crimes of the Israeli state." I actually returned to the statement we wrote after that visit because I wanted to get the exact quote. And I hadn't read the statement for a while. And actually, it's quite good. I did help to draft it. But I had forgotten, so I will share a little bit of that statement with you. "We were never able to escape the jarring sight of the ubiquitous apartheid wall, which stands in contempt of international law and human rights principles. Constructed of 25-foot-high concrete slabs, electrified cyclone fencing, and winding razor wire, it almost completely encloses the West Bank and extends well east of the Green Line, marking Israel's pre-1967 borders. It snakes its way through ancient olive groves, destroying the beauty of the landscape, dividing communities and families, severing farmers from their fields and depriving them of their livelihood. In Abu Dis, the wall cuts across the campus of Al-Quds University through the soccer field. In Qalqilia, we saw massive gates built to control the entry and access of Palestinians to their lands and homes, including a gated corridor through which Palestinians with increasingly rare Israeli-issued permits are processed as they enter Israel for work, sustaining the very state that has displaced them. Palestinian children are forced through similar corridors, lining up for hours twice each day to attend school. As one Palestinian colleague put it, occupied Palestine is the largest prison in the world. And one more paragraph, two more paragraphs. An extensive prison system bolsters the occupation and suppresses resistance. Everywhere we went, we met people who had either been imprisoned themselves or had relatives who had been incarcerated. 20,000 Palestinians are locked inside Israeli prisons. At least 8,000 of them are political prisoners, and more than 300 are children. This was in 2011. According to Adamir, as of last month, there were 5,265 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons and detention centers, including 186 administrative detainees, 20 women, and 202 children. The criminalization of their political activity and that of many of the Palestinians we met was a constant and harrowing theme. We also came to understand how overt repression is buttressed by deceptive representations of the State of Israel as the most developed social democracy in the region. As feminists, therefore, we deplore the Israeli practice of pinkwashing, the state's use of ostensible support for gender and sexual equality to dress up its occupation. In Palestine, we consistently found evidence and analyses of a more substantive approach to an indivisible justice. We met the president and the leadership of the Arab Feminist Union and several other women's groups in Nablus who spoke about the role and struggles of Palestinian women on several fronts. We visited one of the oldest women's empowerment centers in Palestine. We also spoke with Palestinian queers for BDS, young organizers who framed the struggle for gender and sexual justice as part and parcel of a comprehensive framework for self-determination and liberation. Feminist colleagues at Bitzet University, Al-Najjar University, and Mara Al-Carmel spoke to us about the organic linkage of anti-colonial resistance with gender and sexual equality, as well as about the transformative role Palestinian institutions of higher education played in these struggles. And then finally, we were continually inspired by the deep and abiding spirit of resistance in the stories people told us. I think, as much as one talks about the repression, which is so much in evidence, it is important to recognize that the Palestinian people have not given up, and that there is this remarkable sense of possibility. We were therefore, and I'm reading this last paragraph, we were continually inspired by the deep and abiding spirit of resistance and the stories people told us, and the murals inside buildings, such as the Ibda Center in the Hajj refugee camp, and slogans painted on the apartheid wall in Kalkidia, Bethlehem, and Abu Dis, in the education of young children, and in the commitment to emancipatory knowledge production. And finally, we described the meeting at the headquarters of the BD Boycott National Committee, and we write, we were humbled by their appeal. We are not asking you for heroic action or to form freedom brigades. We are simply asking you not to be complicit in perpetuating the crimes of the Israeli state. Now, as we all know, this campaign is inspired by the campaign against South African apartheid. When the anti-apartheid campaign, when the anti-apartheid boycott was first called for, this was in 1959, Albert Luthuli, who was the president at that time of the African National Congress, issued the appeal. He issued the appeal at a meeting in London. The movement was created by South Africans in exile and their supporters. One of the supporters was Julius Nyerere, who was about to become the president of what was then called Tanganyika and eventually became Tanzania. He made the following statement: "We are not asking you for anything special. We are just asking you to withdraw your support for apartheid by not buying South African goods." And so that statement resonates, of course, or Omar Barghouti says a statement resonates with Julius Nyerere's statement in calling for the boycott against South Africa. Although the boycott received widespread support, I'm talking about the South Africa boycott now, among trade unions, obviously communist parties, liberal formation, it was not until the 1980s that the force of the boycott began to reap important consequences. And I'm not saying this because I think we should have to wait another decade or so before we can expect the BDS movement to lead to more dramatic results. But I'm saying it in order to demystify the South African anti-apartheid movement. Many people are under the impression that that movement just emerged shortly before the downfall of apartheid. And that is not the case. People had been working for decades. And we can say now that the BDS movement and the academic and cultural boycott represent the culmination of many decades of struggle in solidarity with the people of Palestine. I often point out that I first became involved in Palestine solidarity work when I was an undergraduate at Brandeis University, interestingly. that I learned Palestinian solidarity from my Jewish classmates. And I would have thought that by now, the egregious injustices of Israeli apartheid should be as self-evident as South African apartheid became. But we know why it is not so self-evident to many people. Because of active complicity on the parts of governments, especially the US, corporations, the United Nations, and individuals who are either ignorant of the real state of affairs in occupied Palestine or who are actively encouraging a false representation of Israel as the only outpost of democracy in the region. And I read the section of our statement where we spoke about Palestinian queers for BDS. And I think it is important to point out that they challenge this notion that Israel is a democracy because it's supposed to be a good place for LGBTQ people. And they write, as an integral part of Palestinian society, we believe that the struggle for sexual and gender diversity is interconnected with the Palestinian struggle for freedom. As Palestinian queers, our struggle is not only against social injustice and our rights as a queer minority in Palestinian society, but rather our main struggle is one against Israel's colonization, occupation, and apartheid, a system that has oppressed us for the past 63 years. And Ayel Gross, who's a professor of law at Tel Aviv University, has stated that for Israel, gay rights have become basically a public relations tool. And even though conservative and religious politicians remain fiercely homophobic, they sign on to the notion that Israel respects gay rights and therefore is the only real democracy in the region. And you know the public relations program is the pinkwashing program. This is precisely why it is called pinkwashing. Since the boycott was called for, those of us who stand together with our Palestinian sisters and brothers have had to make changes in our lives. I can tell you that I used to take Super Show all the time. Until I found out that Super Shuttle is owned and operated by Veolia, which is one of the major targets of the boycott. And I can tell you another really funny story. Some years ago, outside of London, around the time that I was in jail, and there was this major campaign around the demand for my freedom, there was an estate. You know estates in the UK, right? They're not like estates as we do. They're like projects, right? And so there was an estate that was named the Angela Davis estate. And somehow Veolia, because Veolia provides water as well, they claim that as a place to store their water trucks. And so I kept getting these messages from outside London that I had to do something to prevent Veolia from scandalizing my name. Well, we're also aware of other brands like SodaStream, especially since Scarlett and Hanson refused to disassociate herself from that company. And I hear that Starbucks is in the process of developing a contract with a soda stream, so get ready. And then of course there's Boeing, and there's Hewlett Packard, and of course there's also Caterpillar, which is used by the Israeli military. And we should never forget that it was a militarized Caterpillar bulldozer that took the life of Rachel Corrie as it razed Palestinian homes in Rafah on the Gaza Strip in 2003 during the Second Intifada. I want to focus quite specifically. I've been speaking 20 minutes already. So we didn't speak 30 minutes. I want to focus specifically on G4S. G4S, because this company, which is the largest private security company in the world, makes connections in its own profit-generating machine that we should be making in our activism. And such connections are transnational. They reach across boundaries of repression. They move from Palestine to Africa, to Australia, to Mexico, to the US. On Palestinian Prisoners Day 2 years ago, that would have been in 2012, Adamir made a specific call for us to focus on G4S. And it was reminiscent of the decision to focus globally on the Royal Dutch Shell Corporation with respect to the anti-apartheid movement. Here, most of you, there are only a couple of you, I think, that are old enough to remember that in the audience. But if you remember that once Shell was identified as a major boycott target, it energized the boycott in ways that we had not seen before. And so Adamir said, specifically, we call for action to hold to account G4S, which is a British-Danish security company, and its Israeli subsidiary has a contract with the Israeli Prison Authority to provide security systems for major prisons there. But not only prisons and detention facilities where torture and unjust treatment of Palestinian prisoners have occurred. But G4S is involved in other aspects of Israeli apartheid and the occupation regime. It provides equipment and services to the checkpoints in the West Bank along the route of the apartheid wall, and the terminals that isolate the occupied territory of Gaza. And so let me talk for a moment about, before returning to this discussion about G4S in particular, let me say a few words about the institution of the prison and the fact that in occupied Palestine, people, including children, are arrested in the middle of the night and interrogated without the presence of lawyers or parents. And in a sense, you might say the reliance on this kind of repression is an indication of the fragility of the hold of the state of Israel over the Palestinian people. Prison is a fact of life there. And people here in the US, especially Black people and Latinos, Native Americans, and Asian American communities that are targeted by the police, should be able to identify with that process of criminalization. You know, in this country, I would say that virtually every black person, even the ones who have climbed out of the swamp on the shoulders of their sisters and brothers, as Martin has some direct or indirect connection to prison. A family member, a friend, somebody has been in prison. And 2 years, was it last year, I spoke at observance of Palestinian Prisoners Day, and I said that in the U.S., with almost 2.5 million people behind bars, it has never occurred to us to have a Prisoners Day, as they do every year in Palestine. But of course, in Palestine, virtually every prisoner in an Israeli jail is a political prisoner, and the small minority who might not be arrested for political acts quickly become political once they meet their sisters and brothers behind bars. As much as Israel would like to pretend that the occupation of Palestine is working well, the numbers of prisoners indicate that the occupation can only be managed by means of violence and repression. Now, I've already alluded to the delegation that I went on, the indigenous women of color, feminist scholar activists. All of us had been involved for many years in Palestine solidarity. But we were all totally shocked by the egregious nature of the repression. The Israeli military made no attempt to conceal or even mitigate the character of the violence they were charged with inflicting. Gun-carrying military men and women, and from our vantage point, many of them looked like kids. And that was really scary, watching kids running around with these huge weapons with their finger on the trigger almost all the time. One misstep and a Palestinian could be arrested and hauled off to prison, where the Israeli prison service does not even provide adequate medical care, and often doesn't provide hygiene or cleaning supplies. And so we could not help expressing absolute shock that we had not realized that in many respects it was worse than South African apartheid. One of our members had grown up under apartheid, as a matter of fact. And I don't like to engage in what Betita Martinez calls oppression Olympics. I don't like to create hierarchies of oppression. But our visceral impression was that this is so much worse than what we had imagined. Worse than South African apartheid, worse than Jim Crow racism. We realized that the carceral technologies that we had seen in maximum and super maximum security prisons here in the U.S. were very much at use in the so-called free world, which clearly was not free. Everyone we met had either been in prison or had family members and friends who had been in prison. And of course, there are a number of figures that indicate how many Palestinians have been arrested since the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza began in 1967. Between 750,000 and 1 million Palestinians have been arrested. That is 20% of the population. That is 40% of the male population. And this is why virtually everyone has a direct connection to someone in prison or who has been to prison. And this is why Palestinians often have great respect for those behind bars, because historically, much of the leadership of the resistance has come from prison. And so I say that we here in the U.S. can learn a great deal from our sisters and brothers in Palestine. We can learn from their dedication, their perseverance, their optimism, their belief in the power of education. I was so surprised to discover that the literacy rate in Palestine is over 90%. And even though the Israeli prison service provides only a negligible number of teachers for people who are in prison, the prisoners themselves teach classes. Of course, this has been a long tradition. Some of you may be familiar with Antonio Gramsci's experiences in prison. Mandela. And then you might think about the education program that was dismantled by the Clinton administration in 1994 when they withdrew Pell Grants for prisoners. Education and liberation are inseparable, and I think the Palestinians know this better than anyone else. But just a few observations on G4S before I conclude. G4S represents the growing insistence on what is called security under the neoliberal state. And it represents the ideologies of security that bolster not only the privatization of security, but the privatization of imprisonment and the privatization of warfare. G4S is responsible for the repressive treatment of political prisoners inside Israel. And we have learned about some of the resistance to that treatment, the hunger strikes and other forms of resistance. G4S is the third largest private corporation in the world. What is the first? What is the largest private corporation in the world? We should know that. We should all know that. It's Walmart. Of course, Walmart. And the second one is Foxconn. So G4S is the third largest corporation in the world, and I should say that it is the largest, it is the private company that employs more people on the continent of Africa than any other corporation. Visit their website. You will see that. They describe how they provide security for rock stars and ensure that travelers have a safe and pleasant experience at airports. And they sum it all up by saying, in more ways than you might realize, G4S is securing your world. And we can say in more ways than we realize, G4S has insinuated itself into our lives under the guise of security, the security state. From the ways Palestinians experience political incarceration to racist technologies of separation and apartheid, from the wall in Israel to prison-like schools in the U.S. to the wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. And G4S is involved in what we have come to call the prison industrial complex in the U.S. and elsewhere. In the sense that it is a part of that process that has begun to thoroughly entangle our schools with the security state, so much so that we now often have a hard time distinguishing between schools and jails. If we simply look at the regimes and the technologies, the emphasis on discipline, for example. And against this backdrop, I want to just explore for a moment the deep involvement of G4S in the global prison industrial complex. And I'm not only referring to the fact that the company owns and operates private prisons all over the world, and that it is helping to blur the boundary between schools and jails. Schools look like jails. Schools use the same technologies of detection as jails. In the U.S., some elementary schools are actually patrolled by armed officers. As a matter of fact, a recent trend among some school districts that cannot afford security companies like G4S has been to offer guns and target practice to teachers. But G4S, whose major proficiencies are related to security, is actually involved in the operation of schools. A girls' academy in Florida, and this is their language, moderate risk females aged 13 to 18 who have been assessed as needing intensive mental health services. G4S indicates that they use gender responsive services, and that they address sexual abuse and substance abuse. Now, this may sound relatively innocuous, but actually it is a striking example of the extent to which security has found its way into the educational system, but also of the way education and incarceration have been linked under the sign of capitalist profit. It also indicates that the reach of the prison industrial complex is far beyond the prison. And I can also tell you that in the UK, G4S runs sexual assault centers, which have supposedly a feminist legacy. The company that provides security for numerous agencies, as well as rehabilitation services for young girls at risk in the U.S., while it operates private prisons in Europe, in Africa, and Australia, also provides equipment and services to Israeli checkpoints in the West Bank, along the route of the apartheid wall, as I pointed out, and security to private businesses and homes in the settlements, in the illegal Israeli settlements in occupied Palestine, that Asli was speaking about. When I was in London a few months ago, I had the opportunity to speak to a woman her name is Deborah Cole. She's the co-director of the organization Inquest there. And she told me about the case of Jimmy Mubenga, who died at the hands of a G4S guards, in the course of a deportation from the UK to Angola on a British Airways plane. He was handcuffed behind his back, and he was forcibly pushed by G4S agents against the seat in front of him. And this is a hold, it's a prohibited hold, but it's a hold that they call the carpet karaoke hold. And the use of this hold is supposed to be illegal, but it's quite astonishing because it indicates that the person subject to the hold is compelled to sing into the carpet on the floor or into the upholstered seat on the plane. So Jimmy Mubenga was held for 40 minutes in that hold. And by the time there was an attempt to offer him first aid, he was dead. As a matter of fact, that case is still being adjudicated. Initially, the inquest ruled that there was no, voluntary homicide, and this terms we use in this country, but just recently, just recently given new evidence. They have opened the case up again. So let me just say that COSATU, the Congress of South Africa, because I'm trying to talk about South Africa, Palestine. Palestine is the new South Africa in terms of the need to focus attention on what is going on in Palestine. And of course we could talk about what's happening in South Africa, but it's far too complicated right now. I'm talking about the promise of South Africa. And that promise still remains, regardless of what has happened to the ANC and the elections and so on and all of that. But just recently, COSATU spoke out against G4S. G4S runs the Manguang Correctional Center in the Free State in South Africa. And the occasion for their protest was the firing of approximately 300 members of the police union for staging a strike. According to the COSATU statement, G4S's modus operandi is indicative of two of the most worrying aspects of neoliberal capitalism and Israeli apartheid: the ideology of security and the increasing privatization of what has been traditionally state-run sectors. Security in this context does not imply security for everyone, but rather, when one looks at the major clients of G4S security, banks, governments, corporations, etc., it becomes evident that when G4S says that it is securing your world, as the company's slogan goes, it is referring to a world of exploitation, repression, occupation, and racism. When we have described the conditions in Palestine, and especially the segregation that so clearly mirrors the historical apartheid racism in the southern U.S., especially to black audiences, the response has been, why has no one told us this before? Why don't we know this? Why don't we know about the signs? Why don't we know about the segregated highways? And so, just as we say never again with respect to the fascism that produced the Holocaust, we should say never again with respect to apartheid in South Africa and the southern U.S. And this means, first and foremost, that we should expand and deepen our solidarities with the people of Palestine, with people of all genders and sexualities, people inside and outside prison walls, inside and outside the wall. Free all Palestinian political prisoners, justice for Palestine. Palestine will be free. Thank you very much.
Good evening, those of you who are here. You just have to, thank Angela and Asli again for this. So a couple of things before I begin this Q&A. I have some questions that were handed to me, and I have my own questions. But let me say a few things by way of introduction. Can you hear me, by the way? Hello? Okay, that's a little better. First of all, I remember, let me just say what an honor it is to be here with very amazing. When I say with one, it's an honor. Everyone knows, how for so many years I've been following Angela, writing about her, trying to figure out and learn from her, and to be able to share the stage with her more than once is a great honor. We go way back. And I have to say, Professor Bali, you proved to me, you ever heard about circular breathing? Well, when you play jazz saxophone, like a great saxophone, it's called circular breathing, which is basically you keep playing, you breathe in through your nose and out your mouth. and that talk that you get, circular breathing, it was I couldn't write that fast. And also I mean, I'm glad you have that on tape because that you could just take that transcript, you have a small book. And but let me just, by way of prefacing my remarks, you know, the statement that Angela mentioned, that she and Barbara Gransby and Gina Jan and others put together was incredibly important. When I went to Palestine in January 2012, that was a statement that we took with us. In fact, it had just been released. And I was on a delegation with Nikhil Singh, Nefertiti Tatyar, Kehlani Kananui, and Bill Mullen. And so that statement was incredibly important and shaped the statement that we ended up issuing in electronic product. That was really the core statement in terms of solidarity delegations, but also in terms of an analysis of how to support BDS and what it means as a kind of, you know, revolutionary act. The other thing, so I want to begin by talking about the category of crime. You know, it's interesting to talk, to hear us talk about use the term war more than once to refer to Palestinian Authority and refer to really the way in which governance is taking place. And also you talked about choking of civil life. And then Angela, occupied Palestine is the largest prison in the world. And what I think is so fascinating is that we have the capital, the slogan of Free Palestine, which literally means ending a prison system which criminalizes the entire population. And yet, when you began your talk, it began by identifying international law as the framework and Israel as the criminal. Okay, so here we have a criminal state engaged in criminal acts. Violations cut across many categories of international law. And yet it gets turned into the largest prison in the world in which the criminal state is engaged in criminal acts by criminalizing the whole population. So I want us to talk a little bit about that. So are we thinking about the next stage of the liberation of Palestine as a kind of decarceration? You know, what can we learn from all the work of abolition? You know, to think about the next step, even beyond BDS. And this is just the goal.
Well, one thing I would say is that, you know, BDS itself is distinct from a judgment about whether to pursue a one-state or two-state solution. But one implication of the analysis I offered is that there's an inevitability in the trajectory that the territories are now on towards a one-state solution because of Israel's annexation policies present and the goals of the Israeli government, as I stated through the chairman of the Likud party's interview, to maximize control of land in the West Bank and minimize responsibility for the population. If that's the strategy, then the shift ultimately is going to be one from an international law framework to a civil rights framework. And I think that's the thing that is most terrifying ultimately around the notion of one state.
I think your mic might be off. I think your mic might be off.
My mic.
Share the microphone.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll just forget about the lapel.
Yes.
I have a old school one. So we'll do this.
So then if you're thinking in civil rights terms, which I think is the direction, then you start having a different kind of framing of demands that you can make on the Israeli authorities. And those demands are connected to the conditions under which you live, supposedly outside of a carceral system, although because of the regulation that Angela described and that we must have witnessed in January 2012, you know that the way in which checkpoints operate, the negotiation you have to go through to move at all between Palestinian portions of the West Bank is such that you are clearly subject to a carceral regime at all times as soon as you live in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem, let alone the huge, completely barricaded open-air prison that Gaza has become. So these are all forms of carceral regime around which a civil rights framework offers a kind of emancipatory ability to make direct claims on the state, but what do you lose? I mean, so what is that transition? The transition, as I was trying to indicate in the end, what is it that international humanitarian law has produced? It has produced the capacity of the Israelis to describe their relationship to the Palestinians entirely in terms of their own security projects. International humanitarian law actually allows that, right? The belligerent occupant is allowed to, for the purposes of its own security, police and govern the underlying population any way it wants, and does not have a relationship of political accountability directly to that population. International has facilitated this. On the flip side, that regime exists to defend the sovereignty rights of the underlying population. So the trade-off there becomes, if you shift to a civil rights framework, you're shifting to that framework within the governing authority of the Israeli government and acknowledging it as the sovereign to which you address your political demands, which is a huge challenge for a variety of reasons by way of political transformation. But in order to understand and realize how you begin to think about abolition, to think about the carceral regime that Palestinians live under, and to think about the impossible bind they've been put in by the application of a legal system that had the Nazi occupation of France in mind and a 4-year regime in mind in a half century that has completely negated the possibility of Palestinian political rights, you then start to understand the horizon of possibility, notwithstanding the loss of what? The loss of the decolonization framework, for example, where you might think about Palestine as incomplete decolonization, where you have a colonial territory of people with a self-determination right that they're continuing to resist in defense of, who wish to have autonomy, not unity, with their colonial occupants. You begin to have to transform these frameworks, and it's a huge challenge. I don't think it's just a challenge for the Israeli right. I think it's also a real challenge for progressives to think in civil rights terms about how to reframe the political context of Palestinian fighting.
Well, I think that looking at Palestine offers a very interesting theoretical framework within which to think about abolition. Here in the U.S., when we raise the issue of the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment, we almost inevitably come up against the existing state. So we have to deal with the state. Now, if we think about Palestine, we get to imagine the possibility of abolition without the restraint of an existing state. And of course, those who argue that, well, you have to decide, are you for the one state or the two-state solution? And I think Asli was pointing out that question has no meaning any longer anyway. But I think that we can learn a great deal about the prospects for abolition, and not only abolition of imprisonment, but abolition of all of the relations that constitute the prison industrial complex. It really is about imagining a new society. And I think that it would be wonderful to have some collaboration, the Palestinian-U.S. collaboration in terms of trying to at least begin to dream, to use your framework, freedom dreams, before a world without prisons.
Okay. I actually have other questions before I get to them. I want to follow up. Don't mind. Okay, so I end this question with the kind of metaphor of decarceration. But let me just push it back, go into something that you suggested that actually ties to the question of abolition, and that is the decolonial framework. So if we think of, which is very increasingly popular now, of Israel as a settler colonial society, much like so many settler colonial societies, there's a real struggle and debate over what decolonization looks like in that context. I just today heard a brilliant talk by Janine LaPierre that talks about the real failure of decolonization as we know it, and not simply because of the continuation of neocolonial relationships, but because what begins instead in former colonies is kind of shrinking of the state, a neoliberal order that's almost bereft of the state, except for a state that's related to security. The security is really the purpose of the state in neoliberal context. So I guess my question is a decolonial framework enough? Or, or is abolition a way of thinking even beyond the colonial? And I want to take the opportunity here to bring in South Africa, because when we talk about what's beyond BDS, what's beyond winning, each one of these struggles, what can you imagine this new society to look like that doesn't necessarily follow the path of South Africa and the limits of trying to function in an economy of extractive economy, an economy that essentially remains the same even if the political fortunes have shifted. So it is a hard question, but how can you imagine? One, is a decolonial framework even useful? Two, if it is, what does decolonization look like in terms of a future Palestine?
So I think it is helpful to ask the question, what purpose is served when decolonization is complete for the people on the ground? And one thing I think that maybe distinguishes Palestine, there are two things really. On the one hand, you have Israel as a colonial settler society, which is the only remaining colonial settler society that is seeking to systematically expand today. That's actually seeking to accrete further territory, and that's further territory continuing the settler project beyond the borders of what was already established. And then on the flip side, you have a Palestinian comprador elite that was produced even before decolonization occurred and has already produced the mechanism you're describing. So we already have that decolonized future state of Palestine today in the state-led security apparatus that's been produced and the reduced function that the state provides in Palestine, which is to police its own people. Security not of its population, but security for to secure the population from whatever threat it might present either to that elite or to others, notably the Israelis in this context. So what then distinguishes the BDS cause is not coming from that comprador. It's not coming from that group. It's in fact trying to seize back the reins away from the ANC equivalent, if you want, except that obviously the PLO is functioning, the PA is functioning very differently than the ANC was able to in the South African context. But here you are, so in some ways you see what that future statelet looks like, and it looks horrific. And Palestinians on the ground understand the horror that it represents, and so are making demands that basically transcend, travel through, traverse, don't pass, hierarchically through the mechanisms of sovereignty that the PA has tried to create and that follow the exact neoliberal model. I mean, on top of the security apparatus, we're constantly told about Salam Fayyad's credentials as a former international financial institution apparatchik who's come and is constructing the origins, the sort of seedlings of self-determination by creating a functioning economy of industrial estates and so forth. I mean, you basically have a maquiladora state combined with a security apparatus that we're told is the future, the gleaming, bright future that Palestinians can hope for under a two-state solution. That's been repudiated already. Before it comes into existence, it's already subject to repudiation by virtue of civil society action. So the question then is, what kind of imagined future could you have? And what is it going to have to travel to if indeed it continues on a trajectory towards a one-state solution, which is, I think, what is going on? Then the first analytic point to begin from, I think, is how have the Israelis already internationalized their own project? They have created, so for example, Palestinianization of prisoners in the war on terror, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, Bagram, other places. What can we learn from the attempt by other states to use this same model to deploy it to deterritorialize the populations that they seek to incarcerate and thereby rob them entirely of rights? How has that come to be reversed? And what models might have been produced by the reversal that we see in deconstructing these black sites, removing the ability to create legal black holes? Because that's really the thing that Palestinians today are confronted with. The Israelis have engineered a legal scheme of total impunity and produced a policing mechanism from within Palestinians, amongst Palestinians, and introduced the neoliberal order you're describing. So all of those things have been accomplished that decolonization heralded tragically for much of Asia and Africa. That's on the ground. The question is, if you want to start to dismantle, what you're trying to dismantle is not only the Israeli sort of mechanism for repression, but also the Palestinian mechanism for repression that's been produced as a subcontracted model beneath that. Both of those things are the targets for movements. And to start to think about what would it look like, again, I think does go back to not just abolition, but a civil rights framework that makes demands on the actual office holder, which is indeed the Israeli authority. So we're already there at some level. We've already produced the state that is the kind of nightmare vision of what decolonization produced in much of the world. We've also already laid bare the relations between the Israelis and the population on the ground. And the question now is how to articulate that through an alternative legal framework, different paradigm than the one the Israelis have produced, which exonerates them of all responsibility and maximizes their authority at the moment. And that's a slightly different project than traditional decolonization has looked like because, I mean, for the reason of the settler colonial society, the Israelis don't plan to engage in a kind of metropole, periphery, neo-colonial relationship. They intend to stay, and they intend to continue to entrench the architecture they produce, which looks much more like a Jim Crow, I think, in amongst the examples that we've spoken of, and the challenge that South Africans today face, but I think didn't fully anticipate of what the ANC was going to become once BDS bore its fruit. So today, Palestinians, unfortunately, from their perspective, already live in that reality. They already have what Zuma has produced in South Africa exists on the ground today in Palestine, pre-decolonization. And so the targets have to be both already at this moment, I think, in BDS.
Well, let's see, where to start. I think it's also important to think about the limitations of civil rights. Look at the U.S. And what happens when you use a civil rights paradigm that basically establishes equality on an abstract basis. And so now, with all of the people of color who are behind bars, we can argue that, they were duly processed, their rights were respected, and as a matter of fact, if you actually look at the history of former slaves in this country, as numerous scholars have pointed out, the path toward equality has actually been that of recognizing the rights of the culpable. So that Black people achieved equality primarily through the process of having to have their rights respected in the process of being charged and convicted. So that equality is via the route of culpability. So I would really suggest that we need to think really deeply about civil rights and rights frameworks in general. The other issue I would raise is that it didn't have to happen that way in South Africa. And I think it's so important for us to hold on to the promises. I don't know whether activists in South Africa, the ANC, and generations and generations of activists ever really tried to imagine what a free South Africa would look like. Of course, everyone evoked a free South Africa abstractly, but not in terms of asking the question, well, what happens to the diamond mines? Who gets to control all of the wealth? Now, of course, it's members of the ANC who are the billionaires. And the question of the impact of the international economy, the transnational economy, the World Bank, the IMF. And this is where South Africa really could have benefited from an international solidarity. The assumption was that once apartheid was dismantled, the struggle was over. Just as in the history of this country, once slavery, and Du Bois points this out, once slavery was abolished, then we won our victory. So, what if South Africa had the courage to stand up to the IMF, to stand up to the World Bank, to resist privatization? And that could have only happened in the context of a mass movement. Then the outcome might have been very different. And we might be thinking of a different trajectory for Palestine as well.
So one thing to think about is, I couldn't agree more about the limitations of the civil rights paradigm. A member, happily, of the critical race studies faculty. You said that it could not be a clear message. But when I say civil rights, I mean addressing rights-based demands to the Israelis as enfranchised nationals, notwithstanding the failure to enfranchise them. But what are those demands? What should the content of those demands be? And that, returning to the South African model, what was absent in the South African transition was structural transformation. The demand was taken off the table as a consequence of the specific bargain struck by Mandela. And the notion was, if you don't strike this bargain, if you don't maintain the property regime as it stands, you're going to have Zimbabwe, it's going to be this terrible race war, et cetera, et cetera. And that model is going to be even more difficult to challenge in the Palestinian context, because look at the region Palestine finds itself in. Let's imagine the utopian scenario in which not only is Palestine free, but you have some kind of either a binational state with full enfranchisement or a fully participatory mechanism in Palestine. It remains tied at best to Jordan, let's say, borders it controls, et cetera, to Jordan, to Egypt, to Lebanon, to a region in which not only has that paradigm become deeply entrenched of the neoliberal privatization model, not only do those financial institutions directly penetrate, but the Gulf, the Arab Gulf regimes govern the way in which money transfers and remittances and labor flows and so forth in the region are framed. And it couldn't be worse. I actually think you would be hard-pressed to find a worse region for the prospects of meaningful structural transformation and liberation around economic property rights, which would be absolutely necessary. Right? Part of the Palestinian movement is demand for restitution of property and compensation for expulsion, and recognition of what the permit regimes and so forth have done by means of expropriation. But even let's imagine that those things are recognized, you still have Palestine embedded in a regional framework and an international framework that makes these visions unbelievably challenging to realize, which means the thing that did not happen in South Africa, which is making this the centerpiece of what abolition has to look like, has to at least be part of the agenda of solidarity now. But again, we're very limited in our own political imagination of how this can be accomplished. And God only knows. It's certainly so far, it's actually legally prescribed in this country to speak of structural transformation. We simply cannot do it at almost any level. And so our ability to imagine what a free Palestine looks like when we can't imagine what a free America would be.
We're waiting on this number. I'll read this question. I promise you. But it's interesting because structural transformation, political economy, these are the questions that were fundamental. I mean, South Africa is so different from Palestine, Israel, in part because the extractive industries were so valuable and still so valuable. There was a very, and still is a very expansive and unionized working class. And part of bringing down apartheid had to do with the ability, the dependence on the workers, on the capital had on workers. And so part of the ANC Freedom Charter was basically nationalizing the wealth. And exactly, this is what, when we talk about the lack of courage, that was exactly one path. And of course, there are precedents when whether you're talking about our events in Guatemala or you're talking about Allende in Chile, when you start to talk about nationalization, part of our tax dollars go to regimes that take people out. But this is, take that aside. The case of Israel-Palestine is so interesting because you don't have extractive industry. In fact, it's an industry, an economy that's based on deep exploitation, but also the export of the security machine. That whether it's talking about weapons or security, systems, that's part of the economy. Now, one other thing to say about the economy is that it's also an economy based on cheap immigrant labor, which we have to talk about as well. That you have African immigrants, many of whom are also filling in prisons or asylum seekers, who represent part of that. You have low-wage Filipino workers, domestic workers, and let's be honest. You go out to the occupied territories, some parts of the West Bank, you have low-wage Messianic Jewish labor working for Intel companies, doing work at below minimum wage. Now that's a part of neoliberalism that we don't want to always talk about, because we always position it in terms of, okay, you have the Palestinians, you have the Israelis, and then there's not much in between. But there's a lot going on that needs to be sort of understood. Anyway, let me just read this question. So how do each of you feel of international solidarity efforts for Palestine, such as the student groups, how they've influenced the current state of affairs regarding Israel-Palestine, if at all? And as you know, international. In fact, let me read both questions. The first two questions actually are connected. So, how do you feel about international solidarity efforts for Palestine? The student groups like SJP. And could each of you say a little bit about how you understand the BDS movement, especially in the past few months? It's been demonized constantly on campus. It's criminalized in Israel itself. So those are just a couple questions there.
So I, in my comments already have said that I think the most valuable thing that BDS promises is an end to American impunity for Israel. Finally, the production of a space that isn't fully controlled, of audiences that can actually access a message, and of highlighting the ways in which the enterprise of the Israelis is a criminal enterprise. So all of that, I think, is for the good, and of course produces a hysterical reaction in response, because it's terrifying when you've gone to such lengths to absolutely ensure complete immunity from this kind of scrutiny and criticism, to suddenly lose control of the narrative is terrifying. But what I think is striking, and I think is an avenue to begin to really, the first thing is, every time there's an attempt to stifle, demonize, etc., BDS, it's a victory. Because BDS is on the agenda, it is defining what we're discussing, and that is the second thing, I think, is that the attempt to demonize BDS privileges hypothetical harms, imagined harms that might occur to Israeli academics or Israeli corporations and so forth, over the lived, actual severity of the daily harm and even lethal harm to Palestinian society, which produces a narrative opportunity to interject, I think, and to, again, shift the discourse away from their talking points. And that, from that perspective, I think on both levels, both dictating what the agenda is, forcing the mobilization of resources to respond to the narrative and so forth, and then causing a laying out of the cards, right? I mean, it's all about these hypothetical harms, creates an opportunity to really focus the discussion on actual harms. And I think both of those things are incredibly helpful about the victories that BDS has accomplished, including on this campus, by the way. Kudos again to SJP.
Well, I think that SJP on all the campuses has played such an important role over the last period. And this seems to be a period during which there are more openings than I've seen for a long time. And I think we really need to take advantage of these openings, because oftentimes such moments may arise, such conjunctures, and then they're gone. And I think that what really has to be emphasized is the extent to which people are accustomed to engage in a kind of self-censorship. Especially on college campuses, especially in these institutions that are supposed to be in favor of free speech and academic freedom. You know, there has been this long tradition of engaging in a kind of self-censorship around the question of Palestine, Israel. And I think that just as, you know, we have learned that one can stand up to governments. One can stand up to the U.S. government. One can, you know, stand up to the French government. Why is the state of Israel supposed to be immune from critique? And I think that we can build on the work that SJP has played, the work that they've done all over the country. I think Israeli anti-apartheid weeks are so important, and they increased over the last period all over the world, as a matter of fact. I think this is precisely the moment. So every single one of you, remember that. And encourage people to speak out. Tell people they don't have to be afraid. As a matter of fact, it's only when we're small in number that we can be subjected to the kind of repression that we imagine ourselves being subjected to. If we build large communities, then I think we will be able to move forward.
Well, you just answered question number 4, which is all about censorship. And you know, I mean, all over the country, this has been a really difficult issue, from the SJP being attacked in Northeastern, you got people being arrested. I mean, it's really been deep. One of the questions that the students have here is, you know, regarding grassroots BDS campaigns on universities, how do you advise students to push back against the Israeli lobby, which is having a greater and greater presence and affiliations on campus, like Stand With Us, for example? They show up to a lot of these events and produce like just amazing propaganda that says things like, you know, from Paul Robeson to Martin Luther King, that they're all basically Zionists, and that, you know, we're by critiquing Israel, by calling for an end to occupation, you're basically going against the civil rights agenda. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that gets circulated. And so, so what do you say to students? And that's one question, because students want to get help. And the fact is, groups like Stand With Us, you know, they're on campus and they're very, very active.
I'll pass the microphone to you. It seems to me that what our challenge is today is to incorporate into the agendas of all of the social justice campaigns and movements we're involved in, insist that every movement address the issue of the occupation of Palestine. Unfortunately, there are those who call themselves progressive, and organizations that represent themselves as progressive, and we can say except for Palestine. That's always the exception. And that exception should no longer be allowed to prevail. Unfortunately, many of us have been responsible for allowing the issue of Palestine to be isolated and not to see it as related to, as deeply linked to every single other issue that we work on where social justice is concerned. And I think that's the real challenge of this period.
So, first of all, I would say that SJP on this campus has been genuinely exemplary in thinking about how to respond in a number of ways. Well, first, following right down Professor Davis's comments, coalition building. So coalition building, identifying fellow travelers, allies, identifying issue-specific convergences and pursuing them, that's critical. The second thing is not reacting, but producing your own narrative. So that this is an example of that strategy. Having panels that are framed in the terms that you choose, not constantly having to react to the pre-existing framing of terms with which you're confronted. The third thing to understand is the battle in this country to shape the narrative around these questions moved to campuses and NGOs when the battle was won on Capitol Hill and in the media. So you're thinking about trying to shift a narrative that is deeply resourced, extraordinarily well organized, and has been basically organizing in this way for at least half a century, if not longer, in order to dominate the field. So the asymmetry of the conflict itself is reproduced
in the asymmetry that exists between those who would support a Palestinian position or advocate for a free Palestine and those on the other side who represent that political adversary here domestically. So start by giving yourself a break and understanding those stakes, understanding the context in which you're intervening. And then secondly, understand the amount of energy, resource, and organization that adversary has spent on putting itself in this position. Our response is measured in elbow grease. Our response is measured in the kind of work that has to be put in on a daily basis. It's not, otherwise it's not sustainable. We just have to commit for the long haul. That's just the reality of trying to build coalitions, and it exceeds campuses. It goes from one place to the next. I'm now to say I was a student activist around this issue from the day I was in high school through undergrad. I traveled repeatedly as a student to Palestine, worked in camps as a teacher of math, etc., continued through graduate schools, formed organizations, built institutions, raised money, created endowed lectureships to represent this perspective in the universities I traveled through, and then came as a faculty member who's, assistant professor here, and it is a tense environment in which to intervene. You simply have to make a choice at some point. Is this the thing to which you're committing yourself, or are you prepared to commit the elbow grease? Because that is, in fairness, there's a reason why the dominant narrative is as dominant as it is, and it's not some conspiracy. It's incredible hard work, organization, resources, etc., deployed to this end by those who take the opposing position. So in order to bolster our own position, we need to understand what it is that we have to do, and we have a great model ahead, in fact, to learn from, because our direct adversary and framing questions around Israel-Palestine has done an exemplary job, obviously, of organizing themselves. So we have a lot we can learn, but we should begin by noting the incredible, remarkable successes and achievements of SJB on this campus and on campuses across the country, and the important strategic moves that have been adopted, building coalition, reframing, and insisting on a positive framing of one's own position and so forth. And I think we can just only build on the successes that we're seeing around the country and here.
I totally agree with you. I just want to, I've been thinking about the question of coalition, and sometimes I think we too easily use that term. Because coalition assumes that we have discrete issues and discrete communities. And if one thinks about the extent to which South Africa, the campaign against South African apartheid became a part of every progressive agenda, it wasn't so much on the base of coalition. It was about incorporating that call for freedom. You see what I'm saying? I think oftentimes the assumption is that, first of all, you can't get involved in these issues because you don't know enough. It's the experts who really are considered to be the ones who can speak with authority about Palestine. And if you don't have that kind of expertise, if that is not your work, then you feel marginalized. And it's so complicated that there's no way that we could build a mass movement on the basis of everyone acquiring that kind of expertise. So we have to have another entrance point. We have to think about this as, I think, the international freedom issue that deserves the attention of everyone in the world. The eyes of the world should be focused on Palestine because it is about our freedom. It's not just about solving the complicated conflict, the question of the conflict, but it is about the possibilities of freedom for the entire planet in the future.
So, speaking of the possibilities of freedom for the entire planet, so here's my last question, and I'm going to use my chair's prerogative to ask my question, one of my questions, and that is, I'm sorry. But actually, you know what? You all answered every question on here, by the way. Isn't it true? Okay, see, I'm not and actually, this is a question for Angela, and I want to go back to your talk about G4S, and it's so striking that G4S would have these sexual assault workshops. And this is a question about where's feminism on this question, because in some ways there's a logic to the notion that security itself is a woman's issue, that security can be a feminist issue. In other words, you could redefine security from a radical feminist perspective, which is not the security that G4S is talking about. At the same time, there's a way in which I'm sure there are a lot of women who say, well, you know what? Sexual assault is a security issue. They're providing workshops, and I'm for that. How do we change the discourse, and where is feminism on this question of the carceral state and the role that these institutions play? You know?
Well, I'm teaching a graduate seminar, as some of you know, we're here, and we recently read the work of Beth Ritchie, who has a new book, relatively new book, called Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and the Prison Nation. And her argument is that what was called the movement against violence against women went wrong when it embraced criminalization as a primary strategy for addressing intimate violence. And therefore it became complicit in the development of this massive prison industrial complex. So one element of what we call the prison industrial complex is precisely that it's no longer a movement, but they're agencies that rely on criminalization of the perpetrator as the primary mode of addressing violence against women. Fortunately, I think people who are involved in that field, and you know, the agencies have proliferated all over the world. It's not actually surprising that G4S would be involved in it because it's considered primarily an issue for the police. A feminist approach to abolition would also require the abolition of criminalization as the primary mode of addressing these questions of security. And the reformulation of security would be about a whole range of other things. It would be about jobs, it would be about healthcare, it would be about education, and it would also be about innovative ways of addressing harm that occurs in our community. It might, some people use the term, we're also reading your colleagues, Angela Harris, who's your colleague because you're a law professor, right? Article called Heteropatriarchy Kills. So she points out that the gender violence is not only in those traditional places where we expect to discover it, but also in prison, in men's prisons where gender violence that gets reproduced at various levels is actually encouraged as a mode of organizing and controlling men's prisons. So it's far more complicated. But yeah, that's a subject I could probably go on and on. That's quiet right now.
You know, feminists, I think maybe just circling back to Mr. Davis's penultimate point, which related to coalition and progressive agendas and how to center Palestine. I mean, obviously, one set of fellow traveling allies potentially are those who would self-identify as feminists or those who would self-identify as queer activists. And in her comments, she made clear that pinkwashing as a strategy is an area around which there has been tremendous progress, actually, of movement building And whether you think of that movement building as identifying ways in which all progressives might share a priority of Palestine specifically, or if you think about it as using interest convergence around particular issues to try to advance towards that movement moment. Either way, and I think that we're not in a progressive era, really. We're not living at a time when the dominant or ascendant wave is one that is either left-leaning or progressive in a particular way and so on. The movement faces challenges at every conceivable level, from the prison state here in the United States and the carceral system, socioeconomic challenges, what happened in terms, and you made this point, conjuncture, at a moment you get Occupy Wall Street, it emerges, and then the energy dissipates in some ways. It's very difficult to understand how to mobilize and build on movement when facing the level of structural challenge that one faces internationally, but especially here in the United States. So whatever strategy one might build upon, and pinkwashing is a great example of a successful one, to try to fan out and really build a progressive movement that has some shared identity around a set of questions, including Palestine, I think is the right strategy. And feminists and queer activists have been great fellow travelers in that area. So, it doesn't speak directly to feminist theory on the carceral state, although I do have colleagues besides Cheryl Harris, Kim Crenshaw, and Patricia Olson, who's now here in LA as well, who've worked a lot on that at the law school, and it's a fascinating separate vein of research and discussion.
But once again, join me in thanking Professor Davis.
Omar,
Okay, Omar gets the last word.
Well, thank you to all three of you again, and thank you to everyone for coming out and for staying with us to the event. It was really great to have you all here, and I really think I speak on behalf of SGP when I say this really was a historic and very important event. So we hope that this will really help us mobilize and moving forward and continuing, with the struggle. So thank you all. Have a good night.